All right, here's our video today, how the eye evolved. And we're talking about the organ, the eye, right? Not the letter I, which is an interesting story in itself. You go back to the ancient Egyptians or the Phoenicians. The Greeks had like iota, right? And then the Romans, of course. But that's another video for another time. So let's look about how the eye evolved. And let's get a picture up here because we have to go back not millions of years, but billions of years, right? So if we go back to the early Earth when there was life, 3.5 billion years ago, perhaps. So in the beginning, life, early bacteria, for example, they couldn't see anything, right? They just went about their business. And eventually, some life could detect light and dark. That's how it initially started. So let's look at a picture. So here's a picture of all the stages, and of course it's not as simple as this, but we're making a simple video here. So the first life, when we're looking at the first idea of a eye, right, it would be a photoreceptor. So you see on the left. Get my pen working there. Use green maybe. Where is it? There we go. So, I get it working. Let's work it today. All right, there we go. So that's what we're talking about, the first photoreceptor. So perhaps maybe 2 billion years ago and so forth. So the early cells, early bacteria or so forth, they evolved light-sensitive molecules, and they're called opsins. So let's put it here, opsins. Maybe we should change the color. It's too bright. And also opsins and retinol. So that's what the early cells had. And of course, this is all in a response to mutations or adaptations or genes they had in them, right? So they had some adaptations. All it is natural selection trying to survive. And those who had these opsins and retinol, they can detect shadows. Well, what they're detecting is a certain change of light. So when light hits these molecules, something like photosynthesis today with plants, right? When light hits these molecules and energy is made, like a solar panel, so it's signaling the cell that there's some kind of change happening. So they could sense, and let's change the color. They can sense these early photoreceptors brightness. Just a slight sense of brightness. And that, of course, could be a great evolutionary advantage. And over time, that brightness would increase over time. And of course, with that, they can move towards sunlight. The whole goal, of course, was to move towards sunlight to get more energy. All right, let's move on. So again, if you have these photoreceptors and you can detect brightness over time, right, you can move toward the sun. You can move to that source of brightness and get that energy that you needed. Now, over time, through natural selection, those who had these light-sensitive cells, if they were clustered in one area, right, that cluster could be more stable and more reliable, could give you a better reading. And the result was like a localized patch of photoreceptors. So it's kind of a primitive eye region. And all the receptors are pointing outward, so each felt the same light with all the intensity of that. So if we think about a photoreceptor for brightness, now the pigment spot was still doing brightness, but now you can it's more localized. So it can give you more of a sense of where one thing is. It can give you an advantage. Not just brightness, but more localized brightness. And that's where we get the pigment spot. So in simple terms, what localized means is that it's like a very, very primitive eye in a sense. It's not seeing shapes, but it can tell the direction something's coming from in a more stronger way, right? So now flatworms have these today. Like flatworms have these pigment spots, so they can detect where that source of brightness is coming from. Rather, if you just had a photoreceptor, there's brightness, but you don't have a clear advantage if one had a pigment spot where they can detect where that light source is coming from more strongly, and what direction. So we should say the pigment spot gives, we'll write it over here, gives direction. Still not seeing shapes right. That will come later. And you can think of the evolutionary advantages here. When you have this behavior where you're moving toward light, you can get better photosynthesis. And of course, when you're seeing light, you can hide from predators or any UV damage. So you can not only move toward, but you're moving away. So about like 500 million years ago, give or take, right? If you had this cup forming, so now we're at this stage over here, getting this natural pigment cup forming. So natural selection would deepen those pits. See, a pit is being created in a sense if you're looking at that picture. It's like a cup-shaped eye, right? It's improving the direction and the focus. So any kind of organisms then, they can detect kind of primitive shapes and movement. And this would be great for hunting, right? And, of course, for escaping predators. So there's always a reason for this happening, and it's happening in small stages. So let's move on. Now, at the pinhole, now if you may remember, or you may recall, I should say, maybe you did this in science in school or in high school, that the camera obscura, a very primitive camera, uses a pinhole. They call it a pinhole camera also. So you're concentrating the light source so you can see more shapes, more movement. So it's just an advantage from the pigment cup, adding a pinhole. And of course, this would have taken many, many centuries, right? Many, many years, maybe millions of years for this pinhole to occur. But again, it's again more detail, more image forming. Of course, it's not vision yet. And some early fish, probably 400 million years ago, put some time frame in here, maybe 400 million years ago, early fish developed this kind of camera type eye, this pinhole. And of course, over time, it got better. It got better for evolutionary advantages. And over time, you're getting a primitive retina, primitive optic nerve, a primitive cornea. Now the cornea, if that was put in, it could actually bend the light and adjust the lens. So now you're seeing some kinds of shapes. So with this primitive enclosure here, you're looking at bending of light, making image sharper. And it's like an early version of focus. Now, when animals moved on to land, the eyes adapted again. And that's where the cornea, the iris muscles, and color vision started improving very slowly. For example, insects evolved a compound eyes for wide-angle sight. And then you had reptiles and mammals getting a camera-like eyes. Like anything with natural selection, it's fine-tuned over millions of years. So, for example, humans, we have cones now for color. We have the red, green, and blue cones. And we have rods for low light. Now, we're not nocturnal creatures like owls, for example, so they'll have more rods than us. So the eye could also be for daytime, to see colors, and rods at nighttime to see really low light. And of course, as it refined, when you get this complex camera eye, now we can interpret patterns. We can interpret depth and movement. And as humans, we gain this thing called trichromatic color vision. So, in other words, we can recognize when the fruit was ripe, and we can recognize facial cues. So, all this is developing slowly over time with natural selection. And of course, that's just a brief summary of the evolution of the eye. And of course, today we now have technology, so we all wear glasses and contacts. That's our video today.